In the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944, a 20-year-old American paratrooper sergeant named Joseph Robert Beyrle jumped from a damaged C-47 transport aircraft over the Normandy coast at an altitude of approximately 360 feet, half the minimum safe altitude for paratrooper jumps under U.S. Army doctrine. Because his aircraft had taken anti-aircraft fire during the approach, and the jumpmaster had decided to release the stick rather than try to recover the plane, Beyrle's parachute opened only seconds before he reached the ground. He landed on the roof of a church in the French village of Saint-Cum-du-Mont, slid off, lost his radio, and found himself alone in occupied France with a Thompson submachine gun, 8 magazines of ammunition, and a demolition kit. He set out to find his unit. The unit was the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, and Beyrle would not find it for almost a year. Across the intervening 11 months he would blow up a German power station, be captured by German troops, escape twice from German prisoner-of-war camps, escape a third time from Stalag III-C at Oder in eastern Germany, walk 30 miles east to meet the advancing Red Army, persuade a Soviet tank battalion commander to let him fight alongside her unit on its drive into Germany, fight in a Soviet tank for 1 month. Be wounded by a German air strike near the Oder River, be hospitalized at Landsberg, be visited in the hospital by Soviet Marshal Zhukov, and be repatriated to American forces through Moscow in April 1945. He is the only American serviceman of the Second World War known to have served in combat under both the United States Army and the Soviet Red Army. He returned to Muskegon, Michigan, on April 21, 1945. The Army's records of his service were lost for nearly 50 years before being reconstructed in the 1990s. Beyrle had grown up in Muskegon, the son of Polish immigrants who had moved to Michigan in the 1910s. He had been a baseball pitcher of some local talent in high school, had enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1942, had volunteered for paratrooper training, and had been assigned to the 506th Pier at Camp Toccoa in Georgia. He had completed jump school, demolitions training, and radio operator training by the spring of 1944. He had been assigned as a demolitions specialist to I Company of the regiment's 3rd Battalion. His unit had moved to England in September 1943 in preparation for the Normandy invasion. He had been a sergeant for approximately 3 months at the moment of his Normandy jump. The first hours after his landing at Saint-Cum-du-Mont went badly. Beyrle could not find his unit, could not locate any other American paratroopers, could not raise anyone on his unit's radio frequency. He had no radio. He made his way through the village in the pre-dawn dark, found a German power station that was clearly providing electricity for German military communications in the area, and blew it up with the demolitions in his pack. He then continued to look for his unit. He was located at mid-morning on June 6 by a German Wehrmacht patrol from the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, which had been hunting American paratroopers in the area through the night. He was captured at gunpoint without a fight. He was outnumbered and his ammunition was nearly gone, and was taken to a German collection point at Cairnton. His captivity began that day. He was processed through a German interrogation facility in northern France, was moved by rail to Germany in late June, and was placed in Stalag III near Limburg. He attempted his first escape from XIIA within weeks of his arrival. He made it approximately 10 miles before being recaptured. He attempted his second escape in October 1944. He made it nearly 50 miles and was recaptured within sight of the Polish border. The German camp administration, faced with a repeat escaper, transferred him to Stalag III at Alt-Druitz, in what is now western Poland, at the time a German territory 30 miles east of the Oder River. Stalag III held primarily Soviet prisoners of war, with a small American compound at one end. The conditions were severe even by Stalag standards. The food was inadequate. The Soviet prisoners were dying at a rate of approximately 20 per day through the autumn and winter of 1944. Beyrle and the small American population kept themselves alive on Red Cross packages that arrived irregularly through the German Red Cross's failing supply chain. His third escape attempt began on January 17, 1945. The Soviet advance was approaching from the east. Beyrle and 2 other American prisoners assessed that the camp's German guards were preparing to march the prisoners west to evade capture by the Red Army and concluded that the march would not be survivable. They went over the wire on the night of January 17. The 2 other Americans were recaptured within hours. Beyrle made it out alone, walked east through the German lines for approximately 3 nights, and on the night of January 19 encountered, in a snow-covered field outside Stargard, a Soviet tank brigade of the 1st Guards Tank Army advancing west. He had no Russian beyond a few words he had picked up from Soviet prisoners at Stalag III-C. He stood up from cover with his hands raised, held out a half-pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, the most American thing he had on his person, and shouted in his approximate Russian, "Amerikansky Tovarish," American comrade. The Soviet tank crew lowered their weapons. He was taken to the brigade's headquarters, which was at that moment a captured German farmhouse near Stargard. The brigade's commanding officer was Captain Aleksandra Samusenko, a 23-year-old Soviet tank officer who was, at her rank in 1945, the only woman holding a senior tank command in the Soviet Red Army. Samusenko interrogated Beyrle through an interpreter. She accepted his account of his escape from Stalag III-C, accepted his offer to fight alongside her brigade as a demolitions specialist with experience of German fortifications, and gave him an unofficial role in the brigade's headquarters element. Beyrle spent the next 32 days riding on the deck of Soviet T-34 tanks of Samusenko's brigade, using his demolitions training to assess captured German positions, helping interpret the German technical equipment the brigade was capturing on its advance, and on at least one documented occasion participating directly in an assault on a German strongpoint. The brigade's advance through January and early February 1945 took it through several towns of eastern Germany including Stargard itself, then south toward the Oder. On approximately January 31, the brigade overran Stalag III-C, the camp Beyrle had escaped from 2 weeks earlier. The American prisoners still held there had been marched west days before. The camp's remaining Soviet prisoners were liberated. Beyrle was reportedly in the lead tank of the column that entered the camp. In early February 1945, in an engagement near the town of Landsberg and der Warth, the Samusenko Brigade's column was attacked by German dive bombers, Junkers Ju-87 Stukas of one of the Luftwaffe's last operational Stuka units. The attack damaged several Soviet tanks. Beyrle was wounded by bomb fragments in the leg, the right arm, and the side of the head. He was evacuated to a Soviet field hospital. His wounds were not life-threatening, but they ended his service in the Soviet Tank Brigade. He was hospitalized at a Soviet medical facility in Landsberg through February and early March 1945. In approximately the middle of February 1945, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, then commanding the Soviet First Belarusian Front, made an inspection visit to the hospital. The visit was routine for senior Soviet officers to wounded soldiers. Zhukov was informed by the hospital's commanding officer that one of the wounded was an American who had been fighting in Captain Samusenko's brigade. Zhukov asked to see Beyrle. The two men spoke through Zhukov's interpreter for approximately 30 minutes. Zhukov, on conclusion of the meeting, signed an order authorizing Beyle's transfer to the American embassy in Moscow for repatriation, with the necessary travel papers, and gave Beyrle a personal letter of commendation. The order was carried forward up the Soviet chain to the American embassy. Beyrle was transferred to Moscow by Soviet military aircraft in mid-March 1945. The American embassy in Moscow processed him through its own administrative procedures, which were complicated by the fact that the U.S. Army had reported Beyrle killed in action in Normandy in 1944. His family in Michigan had received a War Department telegram, had held a funeral mass at the family's Catholic parish, and had buried a memorial marker. The embassy verified his identity through fingerprints and through his own testimony, contacted the War Department, and arranged his return to the United States via the Soviet Union, Iran route. Beyrle reached Cairo on March 30, 1945. He reached Norfolk, Virginia on April 21, 1945. He reached Muskegon by train on April 22. His family had been notified of his survival by telegram the previous evening. Beyrle remained in the U.S. Army until his discharge in May 1945. He returned to Muskegon, married his fiancée Joanne in the same church where his memorial service had been held in July 1944, and built a quiet civilian career in the city. He had 3 children. His youngest son, John Beyrle, became a U.S. Foreign Service officer and served as United States ambassador to Russia from 2008 to 2012. Joe Beyrle himself rarely spoke publicly about his wartime service through the post-war decades. The story of his service in both armies came to public attention in the 1990s, after a magazine article by a journalist named Tom Gibb in 1993 prompted a U.S. Army Records review that confirmed the unusual details of his service. The Soviet government posthumously recognized Beyle's service in the Red Army in 1994. Beyrle was the guest of honor at a 1994 White House ceremony marking the 50th anniversary of D-Day, where Presidents Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin jointly presented him with American and Russian decorations. He died in Toccoa, Georgia in December 2004, while attending a 506th peer reunion at the regiment's original training camp. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery in April 2005, exactly 60 years after his original return to the United States. His grave at Arlington carries the citations of both armies. The story of his service is in the records. The records, after their 50-year delay, are clear. The fact of his service in both armies is one of the small and strange facts the war produced, preserved by his family's persistence in pursuing the official record and by the willingness of two post-war governments to acknowledge what he had done. The brigade Beyrle joined had its own remarkable history. The 1st Guards Tank Army under Marshal Zhukov had been one of the senior Soviet tank formations of the war, formed in late 1942 from the consolidation of mechanized corps that had survived the early war disasters. By January 1945, it was operating as the southern wing of Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian front in the Vistula-Oder offensive, the operation that took the Red Army from the Vistula River in Poland to the Oder River in eastern Germany across approximately 3 weeks of continuous advance. The brigade Captain Samusenko commanded was a tank brigade of approximately 50 T-34 tanks supported by mechanized infantry on American-built Studebaker trucks, delivered through Lend-Lease and Soviet-built BA-64 armored cars. The brigade's combat loss rate through the Vistula-Oder offensive ran at approximately 20% per week. The tanks Beyrle rode on were being replaced as they were lost. The crews he ate with at the brigade's field kitchens changed from week to week as casualties accumulated. The brigade's combat method, characteristic of Soviet tank operations in the late war, emphasized continuous advance over consolidation, pressing forward whenever a gap appeared in the German defensive line, accepting losses to keep the German forces unable to organize a coherent defense. Beyrle, by his post-war account, found the operational style different from the U.S. Army's but not difficult to understand. He had been a paratrooper. He had been trained for aggressive small unit action. The Soviet tank brigade's philosophy of continuous advance matched what he had been trained to do. Captain Samusenko herself was a remarkable figure who survived the war for only weeks longer than Beyrle's service with her brigade. She was killed in action on March 3, 1945, near the East Prussian town of Zulchow while leading a tank assault on a German strongpoint. She had been awarded the Order of the Red Star and the Order of the Patriotic War First Class during her service. She was 23 years old. The Soviet historical record preserves her name. Her grave is at the Soviet Military Cemetery at Stargard, in present-day Poland. The brigade she commanded was passed to a male officer after her death and continued in combat through the Berlin Offensive in April 1945. Beyrle did not know of her death until decades after the war, when his own son John, working as a foreign service officer in Russia, looked up the records during a posting in Moscow in the 1990s. The discovery, by family account, affected Beyrle deeply. He had remembered her as a young woman commanding a tank brigade with what he described as professional competence and personal kindness. The fact that she had died 2 weeks after he had been transferred to Moscow for repatriation was a piece of his wartime experience he had not previously known. Beyrle's post-war life in Muskegon was, by every account from his family and from journalists who interviewed him in the 1990s, ordinary. He worked as an inspector for a shipping company on the Lake Michigan port. He raised his 3 children. He attended his Catholic parish on Sundays. He coached youth baseball at the local YMCA. He did not give public speeches about the war. He did not write a memoir. The story of his service was told principally by his son John, who reconstructed the Soviet portion of the service from Russian archives in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and presented the documentary record to the U.S. Army Center of Military History for inclusion in the formal U.S. Army history. The U.S. Army's records on Beyrle were updated in 2002 to reflect the Soviet service. The Soviet portion of his record had been missing from his U.S. Army file since 1945 because the embassy in Moscow had not transferred the relevant documents to the War Department before Beyrle's repatriation. The recovery of the documents required decades of Russian-language archival research that Beyrle himself had not undertaken, and that his son did not begin until after Beyrle's death. The unusual nature of Beyle's experience produced one specific operational lesson for the U.S. Army's institutional history that has been preserved in the post-war record. The U.S. Army Adjutant General's Office in 1946 reviewed the procedural failure that had produced the erroneous killed in action notification to Beyle's family in 1944. The investigation determined that Beyle's identification discs and personal documents had been recovered from his crash site at Saint-Cum-du-Mont in mid-June 1944 by a U.S. Army Graves Registration Unit, and that the discs had been mistakenly attributed to an unidentified body recovered nearby. The error was the kind of administrative failure that, in the chaos of the Normandy beachhead's first weeks, was not rare. The investigation recommended specific procedural changes to the Graves registration identification protocols. The changes were implemented. The KIA error rate for the U.S. Army across the remainder of the war ran substantially below the rate of the Normandy weeks. The institutional lesson is one of dozens of similar small administrative corrections the U.S. Army made in the months after Normandy, and the procedural improvements have remained substantially in place in the U.S. military's casualty identification procedures through the post-war period. The Beyrle family's pursuit of the official record across the post-war decades is itself a small story worth recording. Joe Beyle's mother and father had received the War Department telegram on June 17, 1944. They had held a funeral mass at St. Anne's Catholic Church in Muskegon on June 22. They had received a corrected telegram on April 20, 1945, informing them that their son was alive and being repatriated. The local newspaper, the Muskegon Chronicle, had run a front-page story on his return. Beyrle himself had asked his family not to discuss the Soviet portion of his service, citing the developing tensions of what would become the Cold War. The family had honored the request. The full record of his service was not assembled until after his death in 2004, when his son John Beyrle, the U.S. Foreign Service officer who served as ambassador to Russia from 2008 to 2012, completed the archival research in Moscow and Washington that produced the historically verified account. The account is now in the U.S. Army Center of Military History's official record. Joe Beyle's grave at Arlington National Cemetery carries an inscription identifying him as the only American soldier to have served in combat under both the U.S. Army and the Soviet Red Army during the Second World War. The inscription was placed in 2005 after the family's archival work was complete. The wording was reviewed and approved by the U.S. Army Adjutant General's Office and by the Russian Federation Ministry of Defense's archival branch. The inscription is correct. The verification process was thorough. The fact is what it is. The headstone is at Arlington, in plot designated Section 12, and visitors can find it without difficulty among the small white markers of the Second World War section.